You are listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Welcome to this episode of CEO Perspectives, a signature series by the Conference Board. CEO Perspectives are conversations that take an in-depth, objective, nonpartisan look at a range of timely topics that matter most to business leaders. To help make sense of these topics and how they'll unfold, we'll sit down with thought leaders and do what we do best at the Conference Board, provide trusted insights for what's ahead. I'm Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board and the host of this podcast series. And in today's conversation, we're going to discuss how to start a nonprofit organization. So if starting a nonprofit has been a dream of yours, or if you have a passion project that you'd like to take to the next level, we're going to talk about the steps that you have to take in order to start this organization. Joining me today is Paul Washington, the Executive Director for the Conference Board's ESG Center. Paul, welcome.
Delighted to be with you.
Okay, so Paul, you're going to be the expert on this.
Okay.
You're going to help us through this. So, we should probably start. I mean, non-for-profits are huge in this country, just in number and the number of employees. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. They're a very important part of not just our society, but our economy. There are about 1.5 million nonprofit organizations out there right now in the US, and they represent, in terms of employment, about 10 to 12% of the private sector workforce. So they are major forces in our American economy and in our society.
Yeah, and there's so much passion and so much desire, and it's so rewarding to be part of one of these organizations.
Absolutely. So we'll talk about the steps you've got to go through and even the hurdles you've got to overcome. But we both work for a nonprofit.
Yeah,
that's what the Conference Board is. And I got to say, the combination of, if people are looking for a place that lets them have a broader purpose, you can find it in a company, but you can really find it in a non-for-profit organization.
Okay, so what do? You have to. You have this idea. How do you start?
Well, I think that we'll get into some of the legal steps you've got to go through. But I think at the very outset, you ought to have 3 things in mind. You ought to have a sense of what your mission is, what it is you're planning to do. You should have a sense of purpose, why you want to do it. And then I think a third thing that goes along with that is you should have, it's called in the business, a vision. What is the end state? And I think that's really important to have as well, because you may not need your nonprofit to exist forever. It may be possible that this is something that, if you fulfill your mission, you're showing up for a reason every day with your purpose, you might be able to accomplish the goal of the nonprofit in a certain number of years.
Yeah, now an example of that would be like a hurricane relief plan or something, which has a beginning and hopefully has an end at a certain time. But, if you're starting a cancer effort that,
Right.
It could go on for decades or longer. So part of it ties to what's the purpose?
Right, exactly. And will you have fulfilled your purpose? Let's say in my hometown of Woodstock, New York, we have multiple arts organizations, and it'd be nice to sort of rationalize the back office of those. So you could set up a nonprofit whose mission is to help, maybe you start out with this community, move on to others, to help them sort of rationalize the nonprofit sector. And you can do that as a nonprofit, and hopefully in a few years you'd accomplish that goal.
Yeah. So you have to have a purpose and you have to articulate
Right.
it, and it should be big, right?
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to make a little one, and then and you have to lay that out. Okay, what's next?
So a fundamental step is actually to register as a nonprofit with your state. So this is done at a state level. Nonprofits are creatures of the state.
Well, they're companies.
They're companies. They are corporations, or they're limited liability corporations. They are some sort of corporate entity, right? And so just as you would with a for-profit, you need to register with the state. And that is usually a pretty simple process when it comes to the paperwork involved. New York State, for example, which is not known for being an easy paperwork state, it's just a 4-page application, which talks about who you are, where you're operating, what your purpose is. You need it for that. You need to flag whether you're going to try to be a 501c3, which we'll get into, and you have to have your initial directors. But it's fairly straightforward. One thing, a red flag for folks, though, or a flag to put up is, you may need to be licensed by some other part of the state. So if you're operating an elder care facility, you want to operate a school, you want to operate a museum, you want to do a nonprofit in one of those areas, you may well need to get approval for some other state agency.
For the end service.
That you're going to provide, if that's what you're providing. So you may have a couple other hurdles to go through in the state bureaucracy besides just working with the business.
Now, you mentioned New York
office.
State. We happen to be sitting in New York at the moment, which is why you mentioned it. But, a lot of not-for-profits are registered in Delaware, as are most public companies. Yeah,
what you find is it's a little different in the nonprofit world, where in Delaware is really the place to register to incorporate if you're a public corporation, right? That there's a vast majority of major U.S. companies are incorporated in Delaware. When it comes to not-for-profits, they tend to follow the US population a little bit more. So the most nonprofits are in California, the next tier are Florida and Texas, and then New York. So often, given the nature of nonprofits, they tend to incorporate in their home state.
Okay, all right. Now, you need a name.
Yes, you need a name and you need a URL. And one of the things you need to go through when you're registering in a state is you've got to go through often a sort of names index to make sure that you're not intruding on someone else's turf already, and that you're not putting anything in your name that's somehow misleading or things like that. But you want a name. I mean, I think along with the mission and the purpose and the vision, you got to think about, we'll get into this, I'm sure, a little bit of your competitive differentiation. What is your brand? And that goes into the name, that goes into the URL, and you'll want to, register online to get to make sure you can get the domain name you need.
We were looking into this a few years ago, and we actually found that the domain name was harder than finding a name that you could trademark.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, because you have to pick, was it going to be a .com or .org? Most not-for-profits are .org. And those are heavily taken up.
Yeah, they're taken up, and they're sometimes, there are squatters out there.
Right.
So who have gone and already claimed that frontier territory. So you may have to be creative.
So you might have to start with the domain name first,
and then work your way back to the name you want for the organization. Yeah.
Okay. And how do you think about, you mentioned differentiation of the not-for-profit, and with 1.5 million of them out there are probably a lot that are kind of overlapping.
Yeah, and there may be ones even in your area geographically or otherwise who are already doing work. So I think it's, there's a lot of inefficiency actually in the not-for-profit sector, and you don't want to add to it. Right. So you really want to make sure that you're fitting in the right place. And I think there are sort of 3 constituencies that you really want to make sure that you can differentiate yourself with. The first are, if it were a corporation, it'd be your customers. Here it's your clients. Whom are you trying to serve, and how are you serving them that's different from others? The second thing is you're also going to be competing for talent, and not just paid talent, employees, volunteer talent. So how do you distinguish yourself with the worker base? And then finally, and quite importantly, you don't have owners as a not-for-profit, but you do have donors. So how do you distinguish yourself and have a compelling case to make to donors? And so I think you want to differentiate yourself with at least those three key constituencies.
Yeah, so the offering itself needs to be differentiated from the client. You said the client or the people that you're trying to help, or whatever it is you're trying to. So you've got to be different there, because otherwise, the donors are not going to show up. They're going to say, well, we got all these other organizations doing the same thing. Why do we need?
Why do we need you as well? Right. So, so you want to do it programmatically. You want to do it also in mind with the people that you're going to ask to volunteer their time, because that may be a lot of what you rely on. And of course, with the donors as well, who are the equivalent of sort of your investor base.
Okay. So you have your vision, you have your purpose, you have your URL, your name, you think you've got a differentiated deal here. Now what?
Well, you have a couple other things you need to do. Let me talk about, if I could, talk a little bit about, you need to have a plan, right? Because if you're going to go out to these folks—
I hate writing those things.
I know everyone does, but they are, as you know, Steve, they are essential for success. And, one thing you know about a plan is it never quite comes out as you think it will be. But again, you need to have thought through. This is where, not-for-profit enterprise can involve even more work than a for-profit one. You need to have thought through, okay, what is the programming we're offering? Where are we offering? You've got to have thought through the facilities. You've got to think who's going to be delivering the programming. You've got to think through all the other expenses. You've got to think through marketing. Then you have to think through, how are you going to raise money for this thing? Is it one big donor? Are you setting it up largely with your own funds? Who's going to be contributing to support this? And I think when you're planning, you want to have it done in at least 3 phases. You want to think about, what's my plan for the startup phase? What's my plan for the next, maybe that's a year or 2, 3, what's the next 3 or 4 years? And then what does it look like after that? So I think you need to cover every aspect of thought through every aspect of what you're planning to do, and do it in phases.
Plan sounds like a big word. I know it's only 4 letters, but it sounds like something that's really hard to do. But it's sort of like a checklist.
It is sort of a checklist, and and just step back and think about. It's actually kind of fun, because the planning process is a way of getting you to make decisions about and clarifying. I think, and focus. So I actually think you start, it's almost like writing paper. You have your initial thesis statement when it comes to what you think your mission and your purpose and your vision are. It's in the planning process that you really hone it. And I think that's actually kind of exciting, because that's when you can really say, okay, this is really worth doing, and it's worth doing because it's different from everyone else.
Yeah. And then if you write the checklist, obviously there will be things that, tactical things that you're going to do. And that you use that to develop the budget, right?
Yeah, exactly right. Because you've got it. This all has to make financial sense, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's not that, it doesn't have to be that much harder than running a household budget.
No.
In the sense that you have to know what the components are, what the expenses are. And then, you have to make sure that you've got cash coming in.
Yeah. And that's one thing too. I think when you're doing the budget, don't just look at it as an accrual budget. You got to look at cash. Because about a third of nonprofits fail within a few years. So you really got to make sure.
Because they run out of money.
Because they run out of money. And so even if you got money due to you, you got to make sure you got money in the checking account.
Okay, now you mentioned you have to incorporate in the state.
Correct.
A state.
Correct.
And usually that's where you're domiciled, where your office is.
But then you have the IRS.
Oh, no, not them.
Yeah, so.
What? I thought this was not for profit. Why do we have to involve those guys?
Well, because if you want to be a not-for-profit organization in this country, you have to be exempt from paying taxes, right? And there are 2 levels of a nonprofit. So there are a whole bunch of different sort of 501c organizations, and they can be fraternal organizations, trade associations, and so forth. There are a lot of different types of nonprofits. They do not pay taxes on most of their income. We can get into some details of what income they do have to pay taxes on. But if you really want to make a success of it, you probably want to be a 501c3, where not only do you not pay taxes as an organization, but the people who are giving you money can deduct the contributions.
And 501c3 is the section of the tax code, and that's
right.
So they're called 501c3 organizations, but that's where that comes from.
That's where it comes from, right? And if you want to qualify under that portion of the tax code, you have to exist for a particular kind of purpose, a charitable, scientific, literary, amateur sports, certain designated purposes. And then you have to both be organized for it. So that purpose has to show up in your state documentation and say, yes, I'm organized for that charitable purpose, because otherwise the IRS will kick you out. And second, you have to be operated for that purpose. And the IRS gives pretty close scrutiny to making sure that you're genuinely operating this for that public benefit and not for your own benefit or the benefit of a few friends.
So you can't just hire yourself and your friends and then raise the money and pay all of it to your friends? And
no,
you realize you have to do something.
You have to actually do this for a legitimate public purpose. And there's a lot of governance that goes into making sure you're operating a not-for-profit. In fact, just one thing, general for-profit corporation directors have 2 fiduciary duties: the duty of care, they've got to make decisions based on reasonably available information; the duty of loyalty, they've got to act in the best interest of the organization. In some states, like New York, not-for-profit directors have a 3rd duty on top of those 2. It's called the duty of obedience. Sounds kind of religious.
Ooh.
Yeah, that means you have to be faithful to the mission of the organization. So it's actually a higher hurdle to be a director of a not-for-profit than it is a for-profit.
Wow, really interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've discussed now how we get going, how you set it up. Next, we're going to come back and we're going to discuss the implementation phases. We're going to take a short break. We'll be right back.
As you and your company monitor the latest wave of shocks that have battered the U.S. economy, the award-winning forecast team at the Conference Board now predicts a recession by the end of 2022. This recession will further compound the crises that have recently upended original expectations, from a deadly pandemic to a war in Ukraine and the highest inflation in decades. Yet, unprecedented crises also present unforeseen opportunities if you have a trusted, proven navigator by your side. With that in mind, and as the Conference Board has always done, we are providing you with daily, timely, and relevant content that will guide the business community through the economic storm. These trusted insights are being gathered on our website and are available to help your company master the challenges ahead. Visit us at conference-board.org/topics/recession. Then, on November 29th, join us for a live virtual briefing from our economists and other financial experts. It's complimentary to you and your colleagues. Register now on our website to hear the latest on weathering this economic turbulence.
Welcome back to CEO Perspectives. I'm your host, Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board, and I'm talking today with Paul Washington, the Executive Director of the Conference Board's ESG Center. And Paul, we're talking about how do you start and how do you execute a not-for-profit organization. So we've talked about all the legal stuff and how to get going.
Yeah.
Now you have to start the public side of it.
Right.
What's next?
Right. Well, when you're going out on the public side, you've got to first, let's start. You've got to make sure you've got the organizational structure internally before you go to the public. So you've got to have a board. You've got to have some sort of sense of a staff and a team that you're working with, and then you need to go out and you need to, as you would build any business. So I think one thing that you really need is to have a clear message. If you're going out to get donors, this is what we're going to do. You need a clear message for the people you're going to want to attract to your program, whether they're other organizations or they're individuals. You need to have that in place. And then you need to have a sort of a broader marketing plan that gives you a presence, a public presence, because you want people to know about the work you're doing.
Okay, so let's back up a minute. So what if somebody just wants to start a not-for-profit and they really just, they want to start small. They want it to be them, one person.
Yeah.
You still need a board of directors?
Yes, you do. Actually, you cannot incorporate as a not-for-profit unless, in many states, unless you've got an existing board of 3 or more people.
3 or more. Do you have to pay them?
No, you do not have to pay them. They can all be volunteers, so that's fine.
Okay, so that can be cheap.
That can be cheap.
Okay.
Although,
do you have to pay yourself?
No, you can do this all volunteer. Yeah.
Okay, so you can start a not-for-profit. You can raise the money in some fashion,
right,
and have 100% of that money go through for the benefit
for programming. Although, if you have an office or, whatever, you may have some expenses associated.
But couldn't I just do this out of my house? I mean,
yes,
if I'm really trying to start,
okay. You can start really small. No, I think you can do this at whatever scale you want. I just think, though, that as you're doing this, just think people are going to be relying on you, right? If you're delivering, I know a woman who set up her own version of Meals for Wheels. Or kind of organization to deliver food to the elderly. She set it up. It ran for a couple of years. It grew and grew. And then it got to the point where she wasn't able to keep it going. And now all these people aren't getting meals delivered. So that's why I think this.
So it's got to be sustainable.
It's got to be sustainable. I think that's really, if people listening to this come away watching this have one message. Think about how long you want this to go on, and it needs to go on, but think about it that people are going to be relying on you.
Yeah, but it doesn't mean necessarily that somebody needs to start this and dedicate the rest of their life. You can turn it over.
That's exactly right. In fact, that's one of the things you probably want to think about at some point, not too far down the line, which is, okay, I will see it. Like I talked about doing this in 3 phases. Maybe I'll see it through the setup phase, but then I want to bring in professional management when we're up and running.
Okay, this is complicated. All right, you have to have a website.
You've got to have a website. You've got to make sure that you've got a place that has all the information that people want, whatever they're coming to the organization, whether they're coming as a client, or they're coming as a donor, or they're just coming to learn about, what you're doing.
So you got to think about all those constituents.
Yes, right.
Your customers, your employees,
right,
your donors, everybody that you've talked about, and you have to have the information in there for all of them, because it's really your marketing tool.
Yeah,
right?
And that's probably your key marketing tool. You also, I would say, as you're putting this into place, even as you're setting it up, you probably do want to talk to a lawyer and accountant along the way.
Oh, do we have to talk to them?
You have to kind of talk to them. It really does help, because you know what? When you're a not-for-profit, you actually still, as you know, Steve, because we do it here at the conference board, you've got to file a 990. It's a form. You don't pay taxes, but you've got to submit this annual form to the IRS talking about your organization, giving them information.
Yeah, it's a tax form.
Yeah.
All right. Now, you need revenue.
Yes.
Okay. So we've talked about trying to make sure that we scale the cost side,
Right.
and
Yep.
you try to start as small as you need
Yeah.
as you can. But regardless, for programming, you have to either raise money
Yeah.
or sell cookies, or so
Right.
talk about that.
Yeah, and you can do it a few ways. So one way to raise the revenue is if you've got the means, or a group of your friends have the means, you can get it going. If you want to be a 501c3 organization,
Public charity,
you need to have a broad base of donors. Money can't just come from a few people. So you've got to raise money. So you've got to think about how you're going to do that. Now, you can also collect money that's associated with the services you're providing, and that's fine. That income is not taxable. So you can charge people. You can be a nonprofit and still charge people for what you're providing.
Well, that's
right?
what the Girl Scouts do with cookies.
Exactly right. And you only have to start paying taxes on that income is if it's called unrelated business income, and we don't need to go down that pike. But if it's related to your programming, it's actually just fine.
Yeah, and most people won't get into the unrelated
Right.
stuff.
So you want to avoid that as much as possible.
Right. Okay. So you have to raise money. Now,
Yep.
there are sites out there like GoFundMe and other sites that can help with early cash, right?
Yeah, there are places you can go to, but I think, again, I would think of this as a relationship endeavor, not a transactional endeavor.
Meaning?
It means that you want people who share your passion. Because if you want your not-for-profit to be sustainable, you want to have donors or members, however you set up the organization, who actually care about what you're doing and will stick with you.
This passion point is really important. I mean, it sounds
Yeah.
like an emotional, soft thing, but your point is you have to have people who really see the purpose as you
Yes.
do and really get behind it and are willing to give of themselves and open their pocketbook.
Right. And that's true in the workforce generally today. By the way, it's also true among corporate directors who are choosing to join companies because they believe in its purpose. Purpose isn't just for your rank and file workers, it's for everyone. And that, because you are not going to, if you do pay people, you're not going to pay them as much as they can earn somewhere else. If you got volunteers, you're not paying them anything. So you want everyone who's supporting your organization, including your donors, to kind of get why it matters and to share your passion.
That sounds like something that really should be tested up front before you even spend the money on the paperwork and all of that. Go to make sure that you've got some passion behind it that's beyond your own.
Yes.
And it's not just save the toads. It's
right.
it's
as much as you care about the toads.
I do care about toads.
You do,
but it has to be broad-based, and you have to have.
That's right, and that's why you want to sort of do a little bit of a market testing with donors. You want to do a little bit of market testing with the clients. Will there be people who actually want your service? Will there be people who are willing to give the donations?
Okay, now you've got all this done.
Right.
You got money coming in.
Yep.
You got to do something with it.
Yeah. So I think it's really in some ways just like running any kind of business. These are corporations. Yeah. You then have to put it into practice. And look, there are ways to do this where you don't overburden yourself with governance and process at the outset. But I've found that, and I've served on about 30 nonprofit boards, that sometimes the smaller the organization, the fewer resources you have, and the more you actually need to have clear processes for making decisions and for setting priorities. So it's not just a mom and pop sort of thing here. If you're serious about what you're trying to do, you actually want to bring a fair amount of rigor to your decision making.
Well, and when you're really small, you have to rely on your board.
Yes, very much
and
so.
So oftentimes the board is made up of donors.
That's exactly right. And so that way you've got them on board, and they're seeing how the organization is evolving over time. But I think one thing I would encourage people to do is, in addition to sustainability, just make sure that you've got the processes in place to make good, informed decisions. Gut plays a big role in all of this, but but you want to have as much data as you can. I know that sounds kind of foreboding to anyone who's thinking about, hey, I just want to start a nonprofit, but you're doing something important with your not-for-profit. You've got limited resources. You got to use those resources really wisely.
Okay, so now operation sounds like a big word, but it basically means programming, or what are you going to do with the money?
Yeah,
how are you going to achieve the mission? And it can be something that is an event, right? You could do a big annual dinner or some event where you raise that money and you turn it over to, a children's home or for some reason. It could be ongoing, episodic fundraising events, or it could be, you're gathering used clothing.
Yeah, it can be something that
distribution.
Exactly right. And so, you don't have to do it 365 days a year, right? You can figure out how you want to carry out your programming. And there are organizations that are really hands-on nonprofits where you're working with people every day. And then there are others that are a little more episodic throughout the year. As you pointed out, you could run a conference, you could do some sort of convening, you can provide assistance to other nonprofit organizations, right? And then you don't have to do that in the same way. It doesn't, in your words, have to take over your life.
Yeah, and you can look at the analogs that are out there, because there are all sorts of types. There's organizations that build homes. There's organizations that distribute food, clothing, health, shelter. I mean, it's all about taking care of your fellow human being in some fashion.
Yeah, and there's a huge need to help build capacity in other nonprofit organizations, because there are 1.5 million out there. So let's say you're a lawyer, you're an accountant, you work in a professional field, you can form a non-for-profit that, provides services, to some of these other not-for-profit entities that might need your help.
That's interesting. So a donation of in-kind services could be a not-for-profit.
Could be a not-for-profit as well.
Interesting. All right. Now you've got to keep your spending in check here and efficient, I like the rule that you can't cash out, can't exceed cash in. I mean,
exactly.
Right. I mean, so
it works.
How do you do that?
Well, this is where it does actually help to have an accountant or someone who's financially literate, including, if you aren't, someone on your board is, who can really help you do a cash flow statement. You want to look on a month by month and even sometimes more frequently basis of what's the cash coming in, what's the cash going out, and keep an eye on that. The accountants can help you turn that into a P&L statement and things like that, but you really do want to keep an eye on your cash balances.
Yeah, and it's really no different than your own checkbook.
It's just like your household. I mean, the difference between sort of household planning and nonprofit planning, I think, is there are a lot of givens in your household.
Yeah.
You got certain family members, you've got a house, you got an apartment, whatever it is, some of the stuff is given. When you're working with a not-for-profit, you're coming up with a lot of this on your own.
And you really got to count your pennies. I mean, if you're coming from the for-profit world, you don't have all of that, all of those resources.
And there's another reason why you want to count your pennies. You want to both count your pennies and you want to calculate your impact. Because if you look, the donors out there today are really looking for efficiency and effectiveness. We at the Conference Board have been working in our corporate citizenship area here for about 8 decades, working with companies and their corporate philanthropy side, and they are acutely focused on efficiency.
What does that mean? So it's a certain percentage. So what percentage of the revenue goes towards programming?
Correct.
In other words, the mission rather than the people who are working
that's a critical part of it. It's also, what is your cost? Let's say you're trying to train people to be financially literate. How much does it cost you in delivering those programs to get each person up to speed or to provide them with housing? They're comparing you against other organizations.
What's the rule of thumb?
Oh, well, you want to, hopefully you're spending, as you get mature, under 10% on sort of general G&A. It often can start much higher than that as you're ramping up. But if you can get down to the 10% range for general G&A, you're doing well. And that's non-program related expenses.
So you want 80-90% of the revenue coming in going towards cost.
Programming. Yeah, towards programming costs.
Okay, good. You have to be patient.
Yes.
About this. It doesn't just come out of the blocks, on fire, right?
Yeah, I think that there are a few things I've learned in this area. You need to be patient, as you said. You need to be persistent, because these things, you got to keep at it. It may not work exactly the way you thought it would the first time. And I think you got to be passionate.
So the three Ps.
Yeah.
Patient,
Persistent and passionate.
Wow. Paul, I think we got it.
Okay.
Thanks for joining us today. And thanks to all of you for listening in to CEO Perspectives. Every week, I'll be joined by a prominent thought leader to provide insights on the issues of our time. We'll cover all sorts of topics: geopolitics, economics, ESG, human capital, and more. Please share CEO Perspectives with your friends, your relatives, your colleagues. I know they're going to want to listen too. I'm Steve Odland, and this series has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
You've been listening to a podcast from the Conference Board, the indispensable ally that has helped businesses through war, recession, and economic transformation since our founding in 1916. As recent unexpected economic challenges persist, you can find the latest and most trusted insights for what's ahead on our website. Please join us on November 29th for a live global virtual briefing from our award-winning economists and other financial experts. Get the latest thinking in how to best weather the economic turbulence by registering for this free briefing at conference-board.org/topics/recession.